Welcome. I call this meeting to order, and I've lost count on how many task force meetings we've had now. It's been 4 or 5, I believe, but welcome to the August 9th task force meeting. And we're going to get started with an introduction of our task force members, and tonight I'll start down on my left with Jeff.
Jeff Davis, Prairie Meadows.
Tina Haraldson, South Louise.
Greg Neitzert, City Councilor, Northwest District.
Rick Kiley, Sioux Falls City Council.
Marshall Selberg, Sioux Falls City Council. Matt Metzger, South Sycamore Avenue.
Greg Starnes, Cactus Heights.
And again, thank you for your commitment to this effort, and as well as for your sacrifice and time, too. We do appreciate it. Once again, we're here to develop recommendations on how to best address the unannexed pockets of land within the city limits. The recommendations resulting from this process will impact annexation of land not currently surrounded by city land as well, or may impact, I should state. And again, the recommendations will go to the City Council, and that's all this task force can come forward with, our recommendations. It would be up to, ultimately, it would be up to the Sioux Falls City Council to enact anything into policy. And one note that I will make before we get started with our agenda items and ask Mr. Cooper to come up, please note that public input on topics should be addressed to just topics discussed this evening. Okay, Director Cooper. Thank you.
Well, good evening, task force members and public. And I am reminded from our discussion earlier today that our very first meeting was April 11th. So that was at the library. So we've been at this 4 months. And unless we hear otherwise tonight, this should be the last formal presentation by staff, but that's up to you to decide as we continue on with tonight's agenda. So we're going to go through about 11 or 12 slides, and I'm going to start with the first major announcement for you tonight, and that is that the city at this time is not recommending any large-scale city-initiated annexations, such as rural neighborhoods. This has come about, as we've heard over the last 4 months, of some of the concerns, some of the issues, some of the questions, and at least from the city staff perspective and the city administration, we're proposing that to you tonight, that's our position at this time, and we'll repeat this as well at the end of the presentation. However, we still want to leave the door open for the potential if the city would like to pursue an initiated annexation. And this is where we're going to ask you as the task force and as the community to weigh in on those suggested criteria. So these are the ones that we're presenting tonight for further discussion, further input. Again, to go back, these would be criteria that the city may use to pursue a city-initiated annexation. So the first one that we've laid out there is that the unannexed property is 100% surrounded by city limits and development. So not just city limits, but also development. In addition to that, one or more of the criteria would be utilized. The unannexed property is currently adjacent to an improved street and connected to city water or sewer services. So that would be an additional criteria that we could use beyond number 1. Number 3, the unannexed property will be impacted by a capital project such as street improvements or utility extensions. That would be another potential criteria that we could use. The other one that we've listed is that there's some public health or safety issue that could be corrected with city utility connections or street improvements. So if there was an issue where there was some failing septic systems or the water system, there was a desire to upgrade that for better fire protection, that would be another compelling reason that we could utilize. So we're presenting this tonight for further discussion, further input, but we felt it was important that, again, we keep the door open to the potential that the city might want to pursue an annexation as a city-initiated process. And then, as you recall from the earlier meetings, that we would follow that process that's laid out by state law and city ordinance. So let me just stop there. Do you want me to go through the whole presentation, Counselor?
Let me refer that to the task force. Any questions on what's been stated up to this point in time?
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Can you give us an idea of what's a large?
Could you turn your mic on, please, Tina?
Can you give us an idea of what's a large residential development?
Yeah, I think, well, we didn't define that, but it would be basically anything that's where there's more than 2 existing homes. So large could be, relatively speaking.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your answer. Are you saying that anything over 2 existing homes?
Well, again, we didn't define this, but when we say the word large, we're talking about, those. 200, 400? No, we're talking about anything that's more than 1 or 2 homes.
So you're not considering, I guess, I'm not sure everybody's clear. I know I'm not clear, maybe, and I'm a slow guy, but.
Okay. For these existing rural neighborhoods.
Okay.
That most people in the audience
Okay.
are here for, what we're saying is at this time, we're not recommending that we would be going out.
So this is the policy you're adopting for like
Yes.
Split Rock Heights, or Prairie Meadows, 73 homes, that, in other
Yes.
words, this would be a criteria, it would take an impact of one of these, the first, number 1, plus the other ones.
So any of those existing rural neighborhoods
Yeah.
would be what we're talking about.
Okay, yep.
Does that help you out?
Yep, very good, thank you.
Okay,
So if it's just one house, though, that's what we're talking about.
well, okay, I guess we can get into the details. We're just throwing it out, we're asking you to kind of verify. But, yeah, what we're talking about is existing rural development. We're not going to be pursuing that at this time.
But again, so like one house would fall into this category. I'm just looking at my situation here, which
Okay, that's why we've got the follow-up, the
and
other criteria. Okay?
Last but not least, though, I think that because you get a lot of criticism from me and a lot of other people in this and that, in your defense, I think the city does have to have a mechanism to protect itself. But it is using more than one criteria, so I think what you're doing is fair.
So if we want to clarify that policy that's starting out by saying any existing, that's what we need your input on, okay?
Yeah.
What we're saying to you tonight is that we're not recommending that we pursue city-initiated annexations except for the criteria that you would help us put together.
Right, okay.
Does that help you out?
Perfect.
Okay. Matt, does that help you out? Okay.
And Director Cooper, you're referencing forced annexation?
Yes, we call it city-initiated,
Yes.
but yes, it's the same thing. So we want the task force, the community to help us come up with if this is the criteria that we can use to potentially pursue a city-initiated forcible annexation, if that's the way you want to phrase it. So we're putting this out as a starting point for your consideration as we go forward.
Okay. Go ahead and continue.
Then the other major part of our presentation tonight, as we've gone through various meetings and talked to you about infrastructure requirements and minimum standards for development. We wanted to come back tonight and give you maybe more of a clarification as far as where the city administration is at in terms of a recommendation. And there's 2 handouts that everybody got. The first one that's on the white page is what I'm going to start going through. So this would be what we're using as a minimum requirement for what we call new development. And so again, what is the definition of new development? New development would be any property that's annexed that's vacant and is going to involve new construction of homes, of businesses, of offices, or any property that's annexed that's going to redevelop with new homes, new offices. So new development is anything that gets annexed that's going to involve new construction. And these are the standards that we're currently using right now. But we just wanted to go through to verify what the intent is. So currently, when property is annexed and a developer wants to start a subdivision or an office park or whatever it might be, here's the minimum requirements. For water, it's an 8-inch service line with hydrants. For sanitary sewer, it's an 8-inch minimum sewer. The minimum road requirements we have in our engineering design standards, and those are based on the different classifications of roads, whether it's a local, which would be more of a residential street. A collector street would be one that's typically every quarter mile. And then arterial streets are those that are on the section lines that carry the majority of the traffic. So those minimum standards we would continue to use that are in the engineering design requirements. For drainage, we have a stormwater collection system that would be utilized along with curb and gutter. Sidewalk requirements are currently 4 feet wide for local streets if they're not connected to the back of the curb. If they're on a collector or arterial street, they're 5 feet wide if they're not connected to the back of the curb. And then on the arterial streets, 6 foot wide if connected to the curb. So again, the sidewalk is the same standard that we have now for new development. Street lights, they're the standard aluminum with breakaway bases. And then sump pump collection system requirements. The city has a reimbursement program that we make available to new development when they put in a collection system. So let me just kind of stop there again to clarify that the intent of this is to show you what we are currently and will continue to use as the minimum requirements for new construction, new development.
Any questions, task force, on that?
Okay.
Okay.
So here's the next one that we want to present, and that is on the blue handout that everybody should have. As we've gone through the various meetings and we've heard from people with concerns, a lot of questions, a lot of comments about the standards that we just went through. If I'm annexed into the city, you're going to make me put in curb and gutter, you're going to make me put in all this other infrastructure. And we heard from a lot of people that they were concerned about not only the cost, but also what the potential need would be to completely convert over to city infrastructure right away upon annexation. So what we're presenting to you tonight is another option that if existing rural neighborhoods or individual properties are annexed, and those would be typically voluntarily annexed because of our first slide out of the chute. So if an existing rural neighborhood would like to consider future annexation or an individual property that has a house on it would like to consider future annexation, what we're presenting to the task force tonight is another level of requirements that would be less than new development. And Mark Cotter with Public Works team, Tracy Turbeck with the finance team, we've had a number of meetings about this to talk about how we would present this to the task force tonight. So let me go through these. The first one talks about minimum requirements for water service. And again, the requirement would continue to be that standard 8-inch minimum water line. And that's really designed based on the standard of not only providing for domestic water use, but also for fire flow protection. And we would like to have, if a neighborhood or a property is annexed, we would like to have that conversion to city water within 5 years of the date of annexation. So if you're on existing wells, if you're on existing rural water, then we would work with you to have that conversion over a 5-year period. That would be kind of our target. And that would also include fire hydrants. Now, the third bullet point is important because it kind of gets into this transition period. And again, we're talking about, for the most part, voluntary annexations. Once we know that water service is going to be available to this particular area, then we would provide notice to the property owners, and we would want them to connect within 2 years of that notice or through some other agreement as part of the annexation process. So these timelines can be a little confusing as I'm talking to you for the first time. So we work with a neighborhood on a voluntary annexation, and through that agreement, we say that we want your existing rural water system to be converted over to city within 5 years. And we're going to decide at what point we're going to give you that notice that would trigger that 5 years. So that's kind of what we're trying to lay out there. So we're trying to provide as much flexibility as we can that if property wants to be annexed, that we work with them on making that transition to city water as convenient as possible. So that's the intent of this. The second one is sanitary sewer. Again, we've heard a lot from people about if I have existing septic systems and they're functional, they work, they're going to continue to work for quite a while, and the potential cost and disruption to the neighborhood of putting in a city sanitary sewer in some cases might be challenging or even prohibitive. But again, if we're going to annex a neighborhood, one of the benefits that we believe would be considered is the potential conversion to city sewer. So again, what we're talking about, if you have a private wastewater disposal system, you could continue to use that as long as it meets the requirements that it's functional and working correctly. So that just means if I have septic systems in my neighborhood and I'm annexed, the city would allow us to continue to use those. But we want to continue to have that option for conversion to city sewer. So again, through an agreement or through the annexation process, once we know that a city sanitary sewer is going to be available to a neighborhood or to a property owner, then we would have a process that we can make a notification and make that conversion over to a 5-year timeline. And that's by city ordinance that we use already for conversion. So we're trying to provide as much flexibility as well as for water, for what the kind of sewer service we're going to have going forward with these existing neighborhoods. The next one is roads. What we're saying here is that if you want to be annexed and you have an existing gravel or asphalt road without curb and gutter, that you can continue to use that. We just want to provide for 24 feet of width, and that's based on our fire protection requirements. Primarily, that's where that comes from. The same thing with a collector road. If a collector road should be at least 24 feet wide and asphalt, because that's going to carry a lot more traffic than the residential street would. So we're backing away from saying that you have to have curb and gutter. The street width goes down to a narrower standard. And this is really more in line with what the existing rural subdivision ordinance requirements are for both Lincoln and Minnehaha counties currently. Drainage, we heard a lot about that as well, that what impact that might have on an existing residential neighborhood. So what we're saying here is that depending on the environmental conditions, which could be the topography, the drainage patterns, the water table, we're laying out that there's two different options that we would be considering for those neighborhoods. One is that they could just continue to use their ditches and culverts like they have been, or they could look at the potential for some type of a stormwater collection system if they were attempting to improve their existing drainage system within their neighborhood. If they've got problems with a high water table, or if it's a very flat topography, they might want to work with us to make some improvements for that stormwater collection. But we're leaving those different options open to the neighborhoods to work with us on. We're not mandating either one. Sidewalk, we've talked a lot about sidewalk requirements. And what we're saying tonight is that the installation of sidewalk within these existing residential neighborhoods would be at the discretion of the neighborhood or the property owner unless required by ADA. And the legal folks believe that we should still keep that caveat in there unless required by ADA. You know, that's still kind of a gray area for us to really pin down what that means, but we feel that to protect us, to protect the neighborhoods, that we need to have that qualifier remain. But if the neighborhood does choose to put in sidewalk, then it does need to meet the city's engineering design standards as well as the ADA requirements. So we're making it clear that sidewalks are an option, but if they do want to be there, there are standards that they need to follow. Street lights, we have the option of the wood poles or our standard aluminum pole with a breakaway base for those local streets. For the collector streets, we would like to continue to use the aluminum poles that you see throughout the city with the breakaway bases. And then finally, a sump pump collection system requirement that we would say there are none, but we would be open to evaluating by city staff to determine if putting a sump pump collection system within an existing neighborhood could be beneficial or could mitigate sump pump discharge nuisances. So if a neighborhood currently has a lot of issues with their sump pump systems, if they're running constantly, if they have a desire to make improvements to that, then we would be open to looking at that, doing a study, and then putting together a plan to retrofit that through our sump pump collection system reimbursement policy that we currently use for new development. So that's what's on that second sheet as a summary of what we're proposing to you, the task force, to the community, as an option for existing rural property, neighborhoods, individuals that either want to be annexed or that like to consider talking about future annexation. Any questions at that point?
Director Cooper, may I suggest that we just have task force members and people work off the blue sheet now?
Yep, that's what I was asking the task force.
And then we could go back to one of your first slides. Let me flip through mine.
I have one more before I'm done.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I have a question.
I was just going to, do you have any questions on what I've gone through?
I do.
Well, I thought we'd go back because Mr. Metzger had a question about his property, and I think maybe we're in a better position to answer it now that you've gone through to this point.
Okay.
And I'm referring to the annexation criteria.
Yes.
So
Yes.
if we could have that screen up.
Okay. So the purpose of putting this out for discussion is that the city staff would still like to have some criteria that we could use to determine if the city would potentially approach property owner or owners about a city-initiated annexation. What kind of compelling reasons would trigger those types of discussions? Okay. Knowing that we would still have to go through the study, we would still have to go through the city council for approval of any city-initiated annexation.
Okay.
So this is kind of the laying out those points that would start that potential process.
So this, the blue sheet, is quite a deviation from what policy has been up to this point. Is that safe
Yes.
to say?
Yes.
because policy had been not to deviate from these basic requirements for new development.
Correct. Yes.
Now, just to summarize, you're allowing some pumps to a point, at least until they
That's what
reach
we're
their life.
proposing would be our policy.
Gravel
to you.
roads,
Yes. Yep.
paved roads without curb and gutter, ditches, providing that drainage is adequate, things of that nature.
Yep.
Okay, to try to go back to Mr. Metzger's question then, let's say that it gets to the point, because you're not 100% surrounded at this point in time, correct?
Not by developed, but I will be, I don't know, a year from now, I suppose.
Okay, so let's say that once his property is 100% surrounded by city limits, then, for instance, you have a septic tank now. He would be allowed to, because you're on city water now, and city sidewalk too, as I remember. Okay, so he would be allowed to keep his septic tank at least until it reaches its lifespan before
Yes.
hooking up to.
Yes. Based on that blue sheet, that's what we would allow. Yes. Yep.
Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Metzger, if you've got any other questions of your own. I just wanted to make sure we answered his question before we got too far.
Okay.
No.
Okay?
Yep.
Okay.
And again, what we're showing you tonight is not a final,
Right. These are recommendations.
it's a starting point
Yeah.
to get,
And for us to discuss.
to chew
To
on
make
it as
final
a, yes.
determination. Well,
You may come up with others, you may change the wording of these, you may want to rank them differently. That's what we're throwing out, because we just would like, at the end of the task force report, we would like to include this as part of your recommendation. We would like to still have that opportunity for what we call city-initiated annexations. We don't want to just say that we're never going to initiate annexations under
we're
any
finding
conditions.
middle ground
Yeah.
here.
But we're trying to make it pretty compelling of what it would take to trigger those discussions.
Correct. Okay.
Based on what we've heard from the task force and the public up to now.
I have a suggestion for you, though. It's on your sump pump, or on your septic system language, you use if it meets today's standards or rules as far as installation, and I think that language would need to read if it meets the rules on its installation date and it's still in good working order, because if you judged a 5-year-old system by a rule that changed today, it would preclude that system from being allowed to stay.
So applicable laws could mean at the time it was installed.
Time of installation. I think
Yeah.
if they change that language, it'd be fair to everybody then.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Greg?
I guess I have 3 questions on the required infrastructure. On streetlights, is there a city requirement as to how frequently they're placed?
Yes. The spacing of streetlights, we do have a standard, but I can't,
And is that a concern, and can that be relaxed?
okay, I'm going to bring up our expert, Mark Cotter, our Public Works Director. And I appreciate him coming tonight as well.
Thanks, Mike. And Task Force, Mark Cotter with the Office of Public Works. Typically, we try in a rural or even a residential neighborhood to have a streetlight at least at every intersection. There are situations where they can be installed more frequent. There's many neighborhoods in town that will ask for them more frequent. But that would be a minimum requirement, that we try to have something about every block, which is in general about every 330, 350 feet.
Right.
And I think maybe if we got into an existing residential development that maybe has super blocks, then we would just have to sit down and analyze that, what the spacing would be.
Then on the septic systems, I think there's a state law that says that a lot has to be a minimum size or in order to maintain its septic system.
Yes.
How do you resolve that conflict with a new neighborhood being annexed and the lots being too small to meet that state requirement?
Well, what we're talking about is those that already have one in place.
Right.
And they're meeting, They're currently in place and
they're
they're
in a-
currently in compliance.
But they're in a rural area now.
Yes,
So once they come into the city, they're subject to that minimum lot size.
but the lot size is not going to change.
Right. So will they have to switch to city sewer sooner? Can
No.
they wait that 5 years?
No, unless they would want to subdivide their lot
Okay.
at their own,
Oh. So that standard applies whether you're in the country, whether you're annexed or in city limits or outside of city limits?
well, just what we're talking about,
Lot and a septic system.
if you currently have a septic system and you're annexed, you could continue to use that septic system.
Even though my lot's too small to meet the state requirement.
Well, if your lot's too small, then you've got a problem where you're at already, I would say.
So that doesn't apply to lots that are outside the city.
Okay, I don't think I'm answering your question correctly.
It would have to be in compliance now with whether
Yes.
it's state or county regulations that apply.
Right.
And moving it into the city would not change those regulations.
The size of the lot depends on if you have rural, if you have a well or not. You can have a smaller lot size with the septic system. If you have a domestic type of water service.
So I think it's safe to say if it is in compliance now, it would be still in compliance once it came into the city.
Yes. But if you wanted to subdivide your 2-acre lot after you're annexed, that would be the new development requirement.
Well, we have a number of very small lots that I know are on septic systems in Cactus Heights.
So you're saying that they're not currently in compliance?
Well, I don't know.
We'll be right out tomorrow and we'll check on those. Okay.
We've been accused of editing tapes
Yes.
before, but.
Never mind. Then last on the road requirements, and this is just a confirmation, but I think it's important to have it out there. Even if the roads are within the city limits, they can still be private roads and privately maintained.
Yeah, we currently have that option.
Right.
It's
I think
not,
that seems like that was important. Like,
it's not used very much anymore, but yep.
better service from their private providers than the city in some cases, so.
We're trying to actually step away from private roads, but yes, we do have them around the city. Let me take one more stab at your question. So if there's an existing neighborhood that's not in the city limits today,
Yes.
that has septic systems, and they're on small lots, then we would just verify with the appropriate county that they're in conformance with applicable laws.
Okay.
So then after you're annexed, we would continue to allow them under that grandfather. Does that help you out?
Yeah, well, look. I mean,
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's again, one of the technicalities that we would have to look at on a case-by-case basis. And that might be an incentive to eventually convert over to city sewer to eliminate that. But
Okay.
again, that would be up to the neighborhood to decide.
Counselor
Good
Neitzer,
question.
I think, has a comment too. We're following rules different from our normal city council, so I won't require you to necessarily get the chair's permission first, so.
Well, good decorum. So before I ask my question, I think what the other Greg was getting at is, and I don't have it off the top of my head, I remember there is a state law in regards to small lots and whether you can keep septic, but I don't remember if it only applied if you were in city limits or in a city versus, so I think maybe what he was getting at was that maybe they're in compliance as long as they're out, but once they come in, they would be out of compliance and the state law would overrule anything that we would waive.
No,
I
the only-
think that's what he was.
I think the only conflict would be that if you're currently by city ordinance, if you're within a specified distance of a public sewer system, the city can notify you to connect. But what we're saying here is that through an agreement, as part of the annexation, we could extend that out further.
Okay, can you go to what is the blue page for me, the requirements for rural neighborhoods?
Yep.
In regards to the sanitary sewer, so in plain English, the first bullet point is you can keep it as long as it's still functional, the septic tank.
That's the intent of that language, yes.
So, 20 years down the road, it's time to replace it. The city would not issue a permit for a new septic tank at that point. You'd have to make the
conversion.
connection, as an example.
Yes.
Now, as far as the second bullet point is not, does the first bullet point overrule the second as far as, even though service is available, you'll let them keep it, you wouldn't deliver them notice until
Correct.
the
Yeah.
septic tank needs to be replaced?
Correct.
Okay. And then with, if there is a subdivision that has major water problems and they decline to do curb and gutter, and you felt that it was really necessary, would you just not annex? Would there be does that make sense?
I think we would just clarify as part of the annexation process what the city and what the neighborhood commitment would be. And if the commitment is that we are not going to put in curb and gutter unless the neighborhood wants it, that would be part of the annexation agreement.
Okay. And then just to be clear for everybody, there's citations or through an agreement. So when there's, as part of the annexation, a voluntary annexation, a lot of this is negotiable.
Yes, that's the intent.
So, I mean, obviously, some of these are things that you would really like to stick to, presumably, if you don't have or through an agreement, but really, just about everything presumably might be negotiable.
This is the, as they call it, the carrot approach rather than the stick approach,
Sure.
to try to work with neighborhoods as they want to voluntarily talk about it. And if they don't, then we won't be pursuing it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? And I'll just point out the second bullet that you were referring to, Councilor Neisert, under sanitary sewer requirements, it does end with or through an agreement. Yep. So that's the part that could extend it beyond that point. And I believe up above too in water service requirements, it has the same or through an agreement on the third bullet point there too. So again, pretty significant changes on the blue sheet compared to what it had been before on the white. Okay.
Okay.
Carry on.
We also heard through different meetings and communications from task force members as well as the public that what can we do to improve our communication process? And so we wanted to include that as a proposed recommendation or a policy that we as city staff would like to continue to initiate proactive meetings with individual property owners, with existing neighborhoods, to let them know what future CIP projects are anticipated. Not for the purpose of starting the annexation process necessarily, but to, again, to let them know what potential city growth or other impacts they might be want to be aware of. So that's specific to CIP projects, which means the capital program is primarily future road improvements or future water and sewer improvements. We would also like to continue to have the option that if a particular neighborhood or property owner is interested in a pre-annexation agreement, or if they currently have one, that we would have some type of a regular notification to those property owners so that they know that there is such an agreement. As we heard, if there's a change in ownership, which does happen on occasion, how do people know that there is this pre-annexation agreement in place? And what we might see is that once the task force and the city council finalizes this process, that some of those existing pre-annexation agreements might even just go away or might start over. But we would still like to have the pre-annexation agreement notification process there if they continue to be in place.
Director Cooper, it'd be safe to say any pre-existing agreement that exists now, it's not going to be more stringent, but actually less stringent
Yes,
in the
or it
future.
may just expire.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Very good.
The other thing that we heard is that when when there's going to continue to be voluntary annexations, in fact, we just had one Tuesday night, city council approval, that we would like to start a process that we notify the adjoining unannexed property owners so that they know that there's an annexation petition around them or next to them. And again, just to remind everybody that when a petition comes in for a voluntary annexation, there's a number of entities that we notify: school districts, townships, counties. There's a whole list of people that are notified, but we do not currently notify the unannexed property owners around there. And we're just saying that we could certainly start doing that if that was desirable. So it's, again, it's an attempt to do a better job of letting people know what's going on around them. So this is what we're laying out as some ideas for a communication policy and process. Again, for your further consideration and review.
Any questions at this point for Director Cooper?
I would just like to commend the city for coming up with some of these accommodations for what we've heard. I continue to have a little bit of a concern that an individual property owner may not have the knowledge base to proceed through an agreement negotiation. They may not know what their rights are. I think developers do a lot better job of being informed about that. And so I'm concerned that this be applied fairly to all the different people that it could be involved, to make sure they understand to their fullest. Because when all these things are left negotiable, one guy, by being a pain in the rear, could get a better deal than I got, but I didn't know enough to fight it. And I have a concern about that for homeowners, for elderly, for a lot of people.
And I think that's a good point, that we would continue to try to make the process as simple and as clear as possible. And then along with that, make sure that it is being applied fairly to any individual or development that would be impacted. So the magic of how that happens is what you'll help us put together.
And Director Cooper, too, it is safe to say that even after you have discussed the options with the individual property owner, that it still has to, an annexation still has to go before the city council.
Correct.
And the city council is certainly well within our rights to ask those questions and ask what options were made available and so on. And this, I mean, but however, to be fair, we could be, I mean, I'm going to be around at least for the next 8 months, maybe longer. You guys will be around for another 3 years and 2 months for sure. But after that time, it's the city council is going to change. Obviously, the mayor is going to change, but this will be in form of city policy. Also, it might even require some changes of existing ordinances now to allow for some of these exceptions. So again, it would have to go before the city council as well. So there's another
Check and balance, sir.
absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, good. Good point, Tina. Any other questions?
So in conclusion, we want to end where we started tonight by making it clear, with maybe a little tweaking of what this means, that the city is not recommending any city-initiated annexation, such as rural neighborhoods at this time. But we do thank you for letting us present all this information. A lot of it might be confusing. Hopefully it's still not too confusing, but we feel like after tonight we're really turning it over to you, the task force, to take all this information, recommendations, ideas, and begin to put it into a final report based on the timeline that you decide on after tonight. So
Okay.
We thank you for the opportunity as a city staff to present all of this information. And again, we feel that where we started out with by talking about an annexation program has some has some value to it, has some concern from a standpoint of growth of the city, but we recognize that the path that we started down is not the path that we want to go forward now. And so we are agreeing to step back and let this process go forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Director Cooper. And this last statement, which is still up on the screen, I see. It's not on our screens unless you're on that particular TV setting. That we've been stating all along, our responsibilities is not the annexation of anybody, but dealing with the policies. But thank you, City, for coming forward and making this statement. And so hopefully that provides some assurances to individuals that are sitting out in the audience here tonight, and provide some clarification, because I do know that that's been something that you've been requesting. What's the future hold for us? Now, I think we need to, and I'm just going to suggest that we go back to, I know our pages are kind of flipped here. Let's go to the annexation criteria, and let's discuss that further. This page with the 4 criteria, and if you could put that up as well. Albert, thank you. I think with criteria number 1, I mean, before we were even considering should that be set at 50%, at 75%. Well, now it's gone all the way up to 100%, and we can't go any further beyond that. So are there any comments or concerns over the first criteria? Because it would have to be that first criteria and then one of the following 3 where they would proceed with an annexation. Any comments on criteria number 1?
I would just have a question there, whether we are saying it has to be both surrounded by city limits and surrounded by development. That's how I read that those are 2 conditions together. So if you have new homes on 3 sides of you, but you have an empty field that's owned by someone that plans future development, but it hasn't started, is that not 100%?
Director Cooper, do you want to address that? Good question.
Yep. Again, that's the intent, is that it has to meet both thresholds, that it has to be surrounded by the city and surrounded by development. That's the intent of that language.
So it couldn't be just property that we've recently annexed and there isn't any, so that would include Mr. Metzger's situation right now, because it's technically.
Because he's not completely surrounded by development.
Oh, that's 100% of that is not annexed in yet around him?
Oh, it is.
Yes, but it's not 100% developed.
Correct. That's what I was getting at.
Okay.
So he is surrounded by technically city land,
Yeah.
but not all of it is developed.
Correct.
So that criteria would not apply until that development is completed.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
But 12 months from now, when, I'm just assuming, that would be the first trigger in my case, because I would be completely surrounded, and I'm hooked up to city water.
Yes.
So that's when at that point, the city could start their city-initiated annexation at that time.
Yeah, we could start it. That's what we're saying. This would allow us to potentially start it.
Okay.
But if you did start, you could initiate it with the same conditions that we've discussed here, that he would be allowed to retain his septic tank until
Yes, that would be, again, that's what we're going to be using as our criteria.
lifespan.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
So not to get too deep in the weeds, but let's just take an example where you're surrounded on 3 sides and the 4th side is, I don't know, a park, or it's going to be it's a drainage way.
Conservation area.
Sure, it's zoned conservation. Is that developed on all 4 sides, or are they never going to be qualified to
Yeah,
annex?
I guess we can dive into that in more detail. we're asking you to help answer those questions, okay? But
Fair
we're
enough.
just trying to say there needs to be some starting points. Sure. And what are those compelling starting points? So
Okay.
as we get into those details, you help us answer those questions. But I would say if it's going to be permanent open space, you could qualify that as development because nothing else is going to happen to it.
Okay, we'll have to think about it. An accessory parking lot. I mean, you know, I mean, so there's, yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of scenarios.
Director
No more
Cooper,
going
while
into
you're,
the weeds for you.
that was pretty good. While you're up there, has there been an example of like criteria for the unannexed property that had a public health or safety issue and it was corrected by the city
It's
getting
called
involved?
The Prairie Meadow subdivision, we hooked them up to city sewer,
Okay.
but they're not currently annexed.
That was a public health or safety issue?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
to eliminate septic systems that weren't functioning.
Okay.
But I can't think of any recent annexations that we've done to address that specific criteria.
Prairie Meadows was always hooked to the city sewer system, wasn't it?
Not always.
As far as collection.
Yeah, it started in,
Still has hooked it as collection.
it started in the 1970s, but
Okay, 1970s, but
Yep.
what I'm saying is, it's hooked at a collection point. It's not exercising city, and it pays for the pumping charges, or or we're trying to pay for the pumping charges. Is that correct?
yeah.
Okay.
We're just trying to use this as another,
I just didn't want to leave anybody with the thought that we were already on the city sewer as far as up and down the streets.
no, we're just treating your sewer.
You're
sewage,
collecting
yes.
our sewage.
Yes.
Which you've done since the 70s. Thank you.
There you go.
Any other questions about any of the criteria?
The only thing I would say is on 2 and 3, neither of those is controllable by the property owner, and cost is still going to be incurred there. So although I understand those criteria, I think there's a lingering question of pricing an individual homeowner out of their property, even when these criteria are met.
Impacted by
Any other comments on?
I mean, I'll say I agree. I mean, it seems to me, and I don't know, the vast majority of the concerns are the cost. And it just, I don't know quite how you do this, but it seems to me one of the criteria, if the reason is that compelling, that one of the criteria needs to be that the city has allocated funds for the infrastructure, for the improvements.
Okay, as this reads, let's concentrate on criteria 2. The unannexed property is currently adjacent to an improved city street, which is already there, and they're already connected to city water or sewer services. You would think if they're connected to both, they'd already be annexed, but are there examples where they're not?
Okay, say that again.
Well, I don't know that matters, but I think.
Well, there's things like city taxes, there's things like other improvements that the city might require. Once they decide to annex, that is involuntary to that property owner.
Let me go back to another scenario, Greg, is that there could be an existing development area where some of the homeowners want to be in the city limits and some of them don't. And you can kind of know where I'm talking about. So in that case, the city could initiate an annexation study and analyze for the area what the impacts would be for those that would and those that maybe don't. And then from there you go forward and you determine what the next steps would be. That's why we're trying to use that as just that kind of situation we want to be able to have available to us.
Actually, though, I think what the question is, and if we're looking for recommendations, What the real question is how do we fund this annexation without bankrupting the homeowner? And I think if we just quit skirting the issue and come up with that, and I've talked to Matt about it, he's in the banking industry, I'm a business guy, and
But the only thing that they would be funding would be the water and the sewer
well, I
assessments.
understand, and I'm not being critical, don't get me wrong, this has nothing to do with being, my comment that where I'm going with this has nothing to do with criticize. I think, I'd like to applaud you guys for listening. You've heard Split Rock Heights. I think everybody that's here from Split Rock Heights and Pineview can go away tonight with a little more comfort zone than they had a month ago. And I think you listened carefully, and so I think that I'm gonna give you applause. What I'm trying to say, and we're asking for, how do we get the pressure off you when you need, because 90% of the argument on annexation is the cost. Do 100% of the people care whether they live in the city limits or not?
That was the purpose of the blue sheet, was to
I know,
help
I
address that.
think it is great, you know.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to say is, budgets, I think revenue, and it has nothing to do with the planning people, it has to do with mathematics. If I had 60 places I wanted to annex, I'd find out what it was going to cost me to do all 60. And then I'd do a revenue recovery study for the city, and I'm talking to the city council right now, and see if it made sense financially. If it was a revenue, if in the long pull, it was there was revenue recovery, or cost recovery, and increased tax base and revenue in the long pull, it was easier to bear than $30,000 assessment over 20 years, and it made sense for the city financially. And if it truly, basically, if it truly helps the 178,000 current people in the city and increases the population to 200,000, if you divide the total cost by 200,000 and it comes out to $24 a month, then I think the city would need to take a look at the
However, I don't
economics.
believe we're discussing large-scale annexations
No,
now, so
but
we're talking
we're-
most likely individual properties that are already along an adjacent
I
improved
understand that,
street.
but what you're asking the task force to do is come up with a formula that fits all. And I think at some point in time, and my concept of math may not be right, but at some point in time, mathematics is going to come into it, and cost control is going to come into it. With that, I won't get off the
Director
topic.
Cooper, this would be criteria for a city-initiated annexation, correct?
Yes, and every city-initiated annexation would have to go through the annexation study, which analyzes exactly what you're talking about, before a final decision would be made.
And my comment, Jeff, in if we can focus on criteria 2, which Tina had brought up, in terms of city investment, it's already been done because the improved street would already be there. So there wouldn't really be any savings to the city because it's already in place. And the individual.
I'm sorry, I would just say that criteria 2 would not necessarily apply to a residential property. It could apply to a commercial property.
Yes, that was the other point. It could be a business.
Yes.
And if they're already connected to city water or sewer services, or just city water, and would have the ability to stay on a septic tank system, there would be little additional expense to that property owner, unless I'm omitting something, Director Cooper.
As long as it doesn't involve new development.
Correct?
Yes,
That's the key.
yes.
They can't change the scope of their development.
Well, I understand that, and those would be the easy ones,
Yep,
you know.
yeah.
Right.
I think the financial burden is what everybody's worried about. That's all, and I didn't mean to get off topic, but
Sure.
it's still a way to fund it without having to alter
Well, in
somebody on
criteria,
fixed income is
in
what we're
criteria
looking for.
2, I'm not sure that we
No,
are
in
seeing
criteria 2, you're fine. I think
large
you
financial
wouldn't-
burden
you
there.
wouldn't be.
Especially when we're considering if these standards can still be applied, even though it's a city-initiated
Yes.
annexation,
Correct.
which gives you far more options than what you had previously.
That's the intent.
Let's take a look at, because Tina had also asked about criteria number 3. Mr. Neitzer, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to tease out number 3 a little bit. So when I look at this one, an example I'm thinking of is a rural property has a access, they abut, let's say, one of our arterials on the edge of the city that we're going to improve. We're going to widen it or something like that. That's when maybe that discussion would start. That would be
That could be one trigger.
an example.
Yep.
I'm just trying to think if there would be, and in that case, the arterial, that's funded out of the CIP, so and as far as sidewalk, that depends, things like that. But so that generally the project itself wouldn't incur any cost on the landowner. It just happens to be a trigger to maybe look at it.
Our thought on this one is that, as we've discussed with you before, that when the city is going to go out and widen an existing section line road that might be gravel, might be a 2-lane asphalt road today, and there's existing residential development adjacent to it, and we need to widen it out to 5 lanes or more, it's going to impact those adjacent property owners. Would that be a trigger that we would begin discussing annexation with them? And access points, that's kind of what we had in mind with this type of a scenario. Or if there's going to be a sanitary sewer line that has to go through their neighborhood, would we begin discussing it with them? It doesn't mean it's going to automatically lead to annexation, but we would begin the discussion with them.
And it's a perfect time for probably all sides, because when you're tearing up the road, sometimes you're putting in new water service lines, and it's there, and it may be more affordable for everybody to do it right then and there rather than waiting and then having to tear things up again.
And you may end up, Mr. Chairman, you may end up saying you have to meet all these criteria before we would start. Again, we're just suggesting something to start with, that it could be one or all of the following, whatever you end up recommending.
And I think you made an important distinction that is worth repeating, and that is this is just to begin the process of discussion. It may not necessarily lead to annexation, but these are criteria just to begin the process.
To keep that
communication.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that, because I was under the impression that if a property was impacted by a street expansion, that the landowner paid for the sidewalk, curb, gutter, lighting, drainage fees, and all that stuff for that street, that new street.
Not for a section line or arterial street, they do not, except sidewalk. But for local streets, they would.
So when we're talking about a capital improvement, that's an arterial.
Yes. Those are the only ones that the city pays for. The local roads, the collector roads are paid for by property owners.
And then is that when the curb, gutter, sidewalk, and lighting would be applied
For new development, yes.
for an existing homeowner?
Okay, ask me that one more time, so I give you
Okay,
the right
so
answer.
I'm a little old lady living on my property, and you guys decide to widen the street in front of me and make it a regulation street.
It's an arterial street, okay?
No, it's just a main city street. It's not Louise Avenue, it's another
The
street.
city would not be doing that. We would only be doing the arterial streets.
Because I think Tina's point is if it already has sidewalk, curb, and gutter, you're not going to tear it out and then assess them again for new sidewalk, curb, and gutter.
No.
No, my point is,
Okay,
there
sorry.
are properties that are not annexed, that could be surrounded by development, but may not have street improvements on the side where you guys want to put the street. So does the property owner have no expense then?
Okay,
You tell me my driveway can't be where my driveway is, I have to install a driveway where you want it to be because of traffic flow. Or you want curb, gutter, and sidewalk, and on that side of my property, there might be, where you're going to put the street through, it might be my vegetable garden right now. So I would have no cost. I mean, that'd be great, but I don't believe it.
The only streets that the city does are on the section lines,
I
the
could-
mile streets.
Builds all the other streets in the city.
Developers do.
Developers
But
do the
I'm not a
local collectors.
developer. I'm an undeveloped pocket that just is in the wrong place.
Then you would not, this would not apply to you then?
A CIP project would only be on an arterial, like 41st Street. Those are the only ones we do. If you're just on some side road, then we're not going to be
This would not
doing it.
apply.
It's not a CIP project. So it,
And that's
Thanks.
a good point of clarification that
Greg?
Let me just ask a quick question. It's on the road. So you have an existing area that's not annexed, and you're on a gravel road that's 20 feet wide. So the city needs to increase the width of a local road to meet the criteria. Who bears that
the
expense?
property owner would, of 24 feet. Yes. That's what we're recommending
Got it.
as a policy. 4 more feet of gravel.
I do have a question about sidewalks, and Director Cotter would be proud of me. I have my flow chart at home
Okay.
in my office on the wall. So I've got the whole deal that goes through who pays for the sidewalks. But there's one particular example I don't remember off the top of my head. So in this case, you have a rural home, which obviously they've never paid platting fees. Okay, so they're on an arterial. You come in and you do the road. And if they were to take their access away or give up their access and go to the quarter mile, they wouldn't have to pay for the sidewalk. But in this case, you have, let's say, a home where there's no possible way they can get an access. They cannot get an access. They'd have to go through 3 people's properties. Do they get to keep their driveway and their access and not pay for the sidewalk, or are they assessed?
I'll let Mark go after that one.
I think I've got the whole flow chart right. So.
You do, nice work. So on an arterial street, that's on the mile roads, which is like 26th Street, 41st Street, we have essentially 2 criteria since the time we changed it. So the look forward now is if you see a new road improved, we put access points at every quarter mile, okay? And those are considered the free access points, and we want all new development to lay out their subdivisions to access those free points, okay? And that's where, when Mike said, that's the collector roads. Those are the roads that collect the local traffic, get them to the collector, and ultimately out to the arterial street. We've got a number of situations. Prairie Meadows was one. Matt's is another, where you've got an individual property that accesses an arterial street. If you don't have the ability to access one of the free points, one of the big changes was we used to assess that property owner an equivalent local street. Just like you do if you live in a neighborhood like where I live. When that street was initially, we went away with that with the new platting fee ordinance. So the only thing that a property owner like Matt would be assessed for the street assets is the sidewalk, if he has direct access to the arterial street. So there is criteria that we would always walk somebody through. We did develop a flow chart that allows people to, really understand it. But just as you're thinking about, if you're specifically looking at, when we talk about CIP projects, that's when we are out building the Louise Avenues, the 26 streets. They're the arteries. That's why we call them the arterial streets. That's the ones that the city is building. If your property accesses a free point, which is one of the quarter miles, you would have no assessment for that street, okay? Provided you're not platting or replatting. If you have direct access and you can't get to one of those, what ordinance provides is that all you're assessed is the sidewalk. And I think that's probably what you've seen as well. Is that fair? Is that clear?
So to clarify then, in Matt's case, just hypothetically, he can't get through private property. He would pay for, the sidewalk is all he would pay for that entire improvement.
That's right. And it's actually a delayed, so we don't assess him until he's actually comes into the city. So it's a delayed assessment. it's allowed by state law to essentially file a delayed assessment that when Matt's property does come into the city, then that assessment would kick in.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you. That makes sense.
Okay. Very good. Any other questions? Or are there any motions?
Make a motion.
Because we're at a point here where we would like to still move forward with a recommendation. So we would need to have some type of discussion on if we accept this as presented tonight, if there was additional, or if there were changes that you wanted added, or other changes. Because once we have reached our final recommendations here this evening, then I can move on to really what's the next steps would be here.
I'd make a motion to accept as is.
Agreed.
Okay, any further discussion?
The only thing that I would say would be encouraging that language change in the specifying that the septic systems be, if they were compliant under their installed rules at the time they were installed, they're still compliant, which you.
Very good point. And Director
Other
Cooper
than that, I
and
think they're
Albert, I
perfect.
think you have that down at the date of installation, I think, is how it was clarified. Because this is pretty significant progress, and I think it's important that we try to move forward so that because we've just taken a number of steps forward, and I'd hate to delay and then end up going backward. So do you have enough information to put our recommendation, that our recommendation is that we accept this and the criteria as stated? If I could just see a nod of heads, that's acceptable?
Correct.
Because we don't necessarily, so we've reached a consensus on that. And I don't know that we're disallowed voting or that we're not allowed to vote on this. Sure.
I move that we accept those.
Actually, we do have a motion and a second.
Second.
So we've had discussion. So all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Passes unanimously. Very good. So the next steps would be that a summary of the recommendations will be sent to the task force, to us, and that would include the recommendations from our previous meeting too, as well as tonight. That a summary of the recommendations will be sent to all task force members for their review and approval within 1 week time, so by next Wednesday. And then the final summary, so once we get back and we give our approval or want some changes or grammatical changes or what have you, the final summary of recommendations will be then sent out to us again, as well as everybody that's on our mailing list, and that would include email addresses as well as physical addresses for those of you that do not have an email address. And that would be sent out prior to the open house, which we'll have to set a date here. So our next task is to schedule an open house date. And I would suggest the same time, 5:30 to 7. And we have looked into doing the open houses because this situation isn't the greatest for the open house, but we can use both of the rooms that, as you recall, our first meeting was in the public library. And are they A and B, rooms A and B? So we can open that up. And they were both available September 11th or September 13th. And I think that is a Monday and Wednesday, yes, the 11th is Monday, Wednesday is the 13th. Any preference?
What time of day are we talking? Or is this an hour and a half type of?
5:30. It would be 5:30 to 7. And let me, I'll review the other step here, and that's part of the open house. The format for the open house would be there's no formal presentation. It's an hour and a half, as we have scheduled these, for interested public to come and go as they please. And the task force members and city staff will be present to answer questions and or to make clarifications. And it's my understanding, staff, you can bring maps too if you want. For what purpose they would be used, I'm not sure, but they could be available. Director Cooper?
Thank you. The open house concept that we've used in other public meetings is that the library rooms would be set up with displays, large versions of what we put up on the slideshow tonight, so that people could walk around and comment on each area or talk to individual task force members or staff about each topic that is presented tonight. So that's why it would be kind of spread out versus a presentation, a formal presentation. That usually works pretty well. We would have comment cards and other ways that the people could respond and let us know what they think they like or don't like about the recommendations.
Very good. So then at the open house, I guess if we could select one of the dates, one of the two, does anybody have a conflict with the 11th or 13th?
I have a conflict on the 11th.
On the 11th. Are we okay with the 13th?
Yep.
Which is, I think, good because it keeps it on the same Wednesday format then. So we'll go with September 13th, 5:30 to 7 p.m. The public library where we held our first meeting in rooms A and B, just to the left as you enter into the door of the library. So that would mean then in October, so in September we have the open house, and in October, and if you want to look at the tentative future timeline that is down at the bottom, review and discuss comments received at the open house. So we will convene again so that we can discuss what we have had, what kind of types of discussions we've had at the open house, if there's any other recommendations that we want to make, or in other words, any final tweaking that needs to be made based on our open house contacts. Then in November, so we'd finalize that in October, and then in November we would take the recommendations to City Council for consideration. And we haven't picked a date for that, but and I'm thinking that would most likely go to an informational first, wouldn't you think, Director Cooper? And for those of you that don't know our structure, we have 4 o'clock informational meetings every Tuesday. And believe me, they are a lot of fun. So if you haven't attended one, you're missing out on a lot. So next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, you could get a little taste of an information. But we would have this topic, and could be a combination of task force members presenting, city staff presenting, task force members available for comments. That's something that we could actually discuss really in October as we finalize and move into that final step. So I think that, any questions in terms of the next steps? So just to review that, a summary of today's recommendations here and the recommendations from our previous meeting will be sent to all of us by next Wednesday. And so if you could check those and make any adjustments if necessary and return them. And then the final summary will be sent back to us, and it'll be then at that time it'll be sent out to everybody who we have a mailing address or an email address for. And the open house is already scheduled for September 13th at 5:30 p.m. at the public library, rooms A and B. Councilor Neitzer.
So just to clarify for the audience, we would call maybe the one that gets sent out maybe a draft final report, and then we would take public comment, and maybe if we hear something, a recurring theme, we'll reconvene. We can always tweak it before we have a final report.
Actually, once we have had a chance to review it and we've clarified that everything is accurate, that will go out to us again and to the public. And at that point, if they wish to comment, the website will still be available and open for comments as well, too. So you would be able to make your comments. If you did not wish to attend an open house, you could still email your comments through our city website. And again, the access for that, the link is on the homepage of siouxfalls.org. Even I can find that one, so it's a little easier than some of the others that I've experienced in the past. Well, any other questions or comments? Well, that brings us to our open or our public input, and as I had mentioned, we would like you to limit your public input to the topics that were discussed here today. And I'd really like to have, and the other thing too, so hopefully we're not going to hear from some of you as we have in the past about you don't want to be annexed, because we do know that. That's been loud and clear to us. Agreed? Task force? And I'm going to go beyond 7. I'm going to go, as long as task force members would like to go. So yeah, I'm not going to cut you off at 7. Good point. The other thing is, if we could have representation maybe from some of the other rural neighborhoods too that have not had a chance to speak before, if we could give them the first opportunity. But I'm willing to go to 7:15. Does that impact anybody's schedules? Okay. Councilor Staley.
Hi there, Councilor Staley here. I just wanted to say, and I know you've referenced this before, this whole discussion started because of Mr. Matt Metzger over there. And as I've been listening to citizens involved with this, I would like to see us put together an annexation bill of rights for the citizens. We're talking now that we've been hearing from the city about what they're going to be doing. Let's put together something that says, what can these residents expect from us for rights? One of the things that alarmed me about Mr. Matt Metzger was the lack of notification. And I think we need to make sure, I don't know, was it registered mail or it's something where we are assured that that person is getting the notification that they're on the docket for annexation. And also, I think everybody would probably like to have it written down as a policy how this process works, so that if we're talking to you and then in 3 months we'll be going here and then this is how it's going to progress, so that it's really, they know what the expectations are going to be. We're talking about the financial aspects. I think that needs to be spelled out. I just don't want to have any question marks hanging over these people's heads. And I've been talking with people, and they're like, we've got elderly people who want to sell their property. What is to be expected when they're trying to work with a realtor of what's coming around the bend? So we don't want to have that hanging over their heads. And then the last thing I wanted to ask was, on this website, someone asked me this question, are the questions they're asking, are those answers on the website as well? Do we have questions and answers?
We would have to direct that to Director Cooper or Albert or Deborah.
Director Cooper,
Sure.
Are the answers on the website as well, or are we just...
If it's sent as a question, have you been responding to questions? I know that suggestions have been forwarded to all task members when it's been submitted to the website. I don't know that I'm aware of questions that have been submitted to the website.
well, I thought comments, you could make, go ahead.
If anybody submitted a comment on the website, like on the right-hand side of the website where there's a comment section, typically if there's an immediate response that we can provide, we'll email them back directly as soon as we can, and then we forward those comments directly on, unedited, to all the task force members. That's
How about the other people involved? Are they, so they're not able, they're saying no. I think that would be beneficial, so everybody, the questions are being asked, everyone gets to see the answer. Once again, we want unification, so we're all playing by the same rules. And as a city council person, I'd like to know that as well, because it was a little fuzzy when the Matt Metzger thing came up as to this area is being treated this way, this area is getting this treatment. Let's make sure everybody's treated the same way. And again, hearing from these people, I think their input as to what's going to be satisfactory to them is really, really important. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Councilor Staley. Gentlemen, Mr. Colorblind guy is going to say the gentleman in the blue here, so I'm going on a limb.
Jerry Goldhammer, represents South Louise.
Welcome,
I got
Jerry.
several questions here. The first one is where it says on the rural neighborhoods and individual property after annexation that on the sidewalks, unless required by the ADA. So now, I think it's very vague because, you know, you're saying gravel roads or two-lane paved roads are fine. Well, if there's a ditch there, where's that sidewalk going to be? Is it going to be way on the other side of that ditch? Or is there going to be more requirements after you come in and say, hey, we do have to do a sidewalk, but it can't be on the other side of this ditch, so now we're going to have to redevelop this road? And, you know, with nothing in there with the curb and gutter mentioned either, that where it drags people into a lot more expenses just by putting that wording in for the sidewalk.
And I think that was put in there for the benefit of the individuals, just to know that that could potentially take place if there was some type of a case, an individual that needed connectivity in the neighborhood that had special requirements. So we can't make those predictions. And quite frankly, your rural subdivisions are subject to ADA requirements the way it is. So an annexation doesn't impact that.
But I feel that wording is going to open everybody up for a whole lot of expenses later.
Councilor Knights.
I guess I would just throw out that we can't say you will never have to put in a sidewalk because federal law would overrule us. So we really have to have that language.
So isn't it kind of steering it right back to where it was before then? I mean,
I don't believe
where it was
so.
before was the requirement was you will put in sidewalks, regardless of ADA requirements or any other triggers that might bring that forward.
It's somewhat, you know, the theoretical that somebody makes a complaint, you know, like an accessibility complaint, and then that could happen to a neighborhood in the city of Sioux Falls right now. There's some neighborhoods without sidewalks. Theoretically, somebody could make a complaint that it's not accessible, and then we may have to put in a sidewalk.
okay. And then the one other question I have too, when it was brought up about your main section line roads, let's say for example South Louise, where, you know, Sioux Falls keeps growing south. Let's say you own 10 acres property, you haven't developed it, your intention's not to develop it. How would that happen? How would it go forth there when a major corridor road there comes through? If you own that 10 acres and you don't develop it, let's say you own it till the day you die, are you going to be assessed for that? Because according to what you guys said tonight, you would not be assessed to widen that road.
If it's a major arterial road, and that's the section line roads, correct, Director Cooper?
Has it always been that way?
Department, but I learn something new every day, and it's, I think pretty soon I'm going to have to start sending a charge to the planning department. But anyway, yeah, and if it's of a major arterial road, section line road, that the city is responsible for doing that.
Okay. But let's say the person did develop that 10 acres later, would there be
Platting fees?
to recollect for that major road or not?
No, the neighborhood, what's the term that you use for the neighborhood roads? It's not even a collector street, but Director Cotter.
I think platting fees are going to recover it when they develop, but I'll let him answer that.
The developer would basically be paying for those improvements.
That's a good question. So the subject was if you have a 10-acre parcel next to an arterial street, if you never develop it, if you don't have direct access off that arterial street, you don't bear any cost. If you were to develop it and you want to subdivide it into, say, 40 lots, you're going to, when you subdivide, you're going to plat, and then there's a whole schedule of platting fees. You'd pay for that instead of the road. Okay?
What about where I do have direct access on that? The 10 acres access is right off it onto the major corridor road.
So then we'll look at a test is, are you coming out on one of the, what I call the free access points, which is a quarter mile. So that's why every one of these developments has to go through a criterion. It's I mean, it's hard to do a number of hypotheticals, but I would tell you, in general, we would encourage you to try to get your key access to one of the quarter-mile access points, either quarter, half, or three-quarter. That's just better for connectivity and managing traffic. If we can't, then likely you'll subdivide that. Maybe you'll subdivide that 10 acres in that parcel that has direct access onto that arterial street. If you're already platted and you're not intending to pay any more platting fees, then you'll pay for that sidewalk. Okay.
Anything else, Jerry?
No, thanks for your time.
Great questions and topic specific. Thank you very much, Jerry.
Got some slides that Tom put on this machine earlier today.
Does it apply to topics
Yes,
to discuss this
It
evening?
really does, exactly to this evening's. But while I'm waiting for that, let me, add my thanks to the city for the major change in policy that was announced tonight.
And could you identify yourself for the
Kevin Gallo,
viewing?
and I am from Split Rock.
Thank you.
But related to tonight's discussion, and I don't know if is this showing up on your monitors or just up there, but related to tonight's discussion, the policy announced tonight is great, but we all know that policies change. So we would, I'd ask that the task force, just as you consider the triggers mentioned tonight, that you also consider. Can you advance? Oh, thank you. All right, thanks. There should also be indicators that are included in your recommendations that would cause the city to recognize areas where annexation is not appropriate. Those could include, adequate services exist, either provided by the township, the county, or other. Current infrastructure is functional. New infrastructure very destructive to current properties. Majority of homeowners oppose annexation, and a negative cost-benefit analysis. And just briefly on that last one, at the first meeting held here, a resident of Sioux Falls, not one of the potential areas to be annexed, a resident of Sioux Falls, the first person to speak, asked that the city conduct cost-benefit analysis for several of the proposed areas of annexation related to long-term maintenance, repair, and replacement obligations. He cited a Memphis, Tennessee example of a cost-benefit analysis that found that it was a negative financial implications for the city, areas that were already annexed. So they were looking at areas for de-annexation. They actually now have a task force. So I don't know about you, but I would hate to see you guys come back in 5 or 10 years or somebody else with a de-annexation task force because some areas, through a change in the new policy, were forcibly annexed. So I'm just saying perhaps there's something from the Memphis experience that Sioux Falls can learn from, and it sounds like maybe we have, and we're to be congratulated for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman in the back of the room first. Thank you.
My name is Jim Weichsel. I'm with Martindale Edition, kind of in the northeast part of Sioux Falls.
Welcome, Jim.
I'm going to ask Mike a couple of questions. If we can back up to that criteria slide that we had up there. Another one. Keep going. Okay. Once we get it back up there. I'm not sure, Mike, but you're aware of our neighborhood where we are up in the Martindale? Okay. What I'm trying to understand, and I don't know, Mike, would we be considered 100% surrounded by the city? And not currently developed, but where we happen to be located, so that people know, is we're between the Sanford Pentagon and Interstate 29 on Benson Road. Okay. We obviously are not in favor of being drawn in, but we feel like we have a unique situation where that's going to develop very fast when it does, because the large parcels that are available, the massive development, the way things are picking up. So what I'm a little concerned about is I think we might meet 3 of those criteria areas already, just being a dumb guy. I mean, that's how it kind of comes off. So hopefully we don't. But what I was going to mention is, in doing this stuff, if you happen to line up on several of these things kind of uniquely, could we not ask that we get some time to talk to the city council, or that they would give us an opportunity to come out and examine our situation, eyes on, picture paints 1,000 words type thing, so that they could understand, does it make good sense? Is there a benefit derived for everybody? Because otherwise, I think sometimes it gets lost in the paper. And we are a small neighborhood. We've got 18, 19 houses there. There's no more future development for residential in that area, from my understanding. So we kind of see us as being a dying vine there, that at some point in time, it might just well be that it'd be easier to buy us out of there than it would be to put up with having a neighborhood in the cluster of everything. So what I would just ask is a little bit of protection from the city. Financially, it's a hardship for everybody, and I realize right now is not a good financial time for the city. It'd be no more than if we were asking things of you at a time you couldn't afford it. You might be asking things of us at a time we can't afford, and because of that, I would really like due diligence by the people making those decisions to come out, interview the property owners, see what's going on, and understand the situation at hand. It isn't always the way you want it, but at least make sure that the right decision is being made rather than just round holes, round pegs.
Heard Jim, loud and clear. Thank you. And the part of the process would be that if the criteria were met, then the discussion would begin. And then eventually, at the least, it would have to lead to a study. And then from there, it would come to the city council, and that's going to most likely come in an informational, and then again in a first reading, and then again in a second reading. And so there would be a number of steps there that would involve not only your city staff and a study, but also the city council too. Welcome. We're at 7:08.
Hi, I'm Lanny Beam from Split Rock. I've got several questions on the presentation that was made here. Can we go back to that criteria slide one more time, please? Criteria 3, and I'm going to be very specific. It talks about CIP projects, specifically on Split Rock. Assuming you've already surrounded us with development, if and when you decide to widen 26th Street, does that automatically put us in the target that says, yes, now we'd ought to try and annex this area?
I believe you stated criteria number 1 was met.
Assuming number 1 is met, and then when 26th Street is widened, does that satisfy criteria 3?
That could be, if it's one in addition to criteria 1, if it's one or more of the following, then it could initiate the discussion. The improvements on the 26th Street, though, since that's an arterial and section line, would be at the city cost.
Understood that.
Okay.
Thank you. Just to be sure I understand, once an area is annexed, people can stay on septic until it fails, but they cannot repair it or
Correct.
replace it. Is that correct?
What I understand, yes.
Okay.
I think I'm not familiar with septic tanks, so I'm not sure what is. I think if it's repairable and it still meets its function, that's something different. I think once it gets to the point where it does not meet that classification or the criteria that deems it.
And also if there's public sewer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There was one of the earlier slides after this that talked about storm sewer. It could be as is, ditches and culverts, or what I would call storm sewer. Now, who makes that decision of which way an area should go? It said we can do one or the other, but who gets to make that decision?
All these things would be part of the annexation agreement that would have to be reviewed by the neighborhood.
Director Cooper, could you step up to the microphones, please?
The intent would be that any property that would be annexed, there would be an agreement that would outline all these standards of what the expectations would be from the property owners or from the city. So as Mark Cotter said, every location is a little bit unique, so that's why these guidelines are going to be somewhat flexible.
Correct. Thank you.
So then that conceivably still negotiable at that time of the annexation agreement.
My understanding, yes.
Okay. One of the things I've not heard discussed very much here is private roads. Now, I did hear tonight that they want roads, whether they be gravel or asphalt, to be 24 foot to accommodate city fire trucks. The private roads, and there are several in our neighborhood, are a far cry from 24 foot wide. What happens in those situations?
In this situation, the 20-foot wide criteria would apply then.
Okay, and
because it would technically, it wouldn't be a private road once you've been annexed into the city.
okay.
Well, it could be.
It's more complicated all the time.
It does.
I'm sorry.
I noticed he jumped out of his seat pretty quick, so maybe I just lost my job.
No. So I think this, again, tonight is the beginning. This is not the final version. And what I'm hearing is that we need to put another bullet point in here about private versus public roads. Public roads, the intent is that this is the standard that you would have to meet. And if there's a need to also have a different standard for private roads, then that's something that maybe we should look at.
Okay, good.
Does that help you out?
Great point, Lonnie.
It helps me to the extent of saying, okay, there's another classification. And I'll wait for the outcome of where that's at. Thank you very much.
Much, Monty. Thanks for helping us get there, too.
Jeff Kirk, Police Blue Rock Heights. I guess my question for you is, way I'm understanding it, what you said is the city is not recommending any large-scale city initiations right now, right? What kind of timeline are you talking about, though? I mean, is it because the city doesn't have any money to do it right now? Or what's the reasoning? Or how long of timeline are you talking? Because that's something that people want to know. I mean,
And again, the semantics are important to everybody because we knew that when we put up here at this time, everybody's going to say, well, what does that really mean? The simplest way that I can reinforce this is that as we've heard all the discussion through this process since back to April, we do not feel that there's any support by the public or by the elected officials to pursue the city to initiate annexation of these rural neighborhoods. Now, is that going to potentially change someday? I don't know. I can't control that. But what we want to do as a follow-up to that is put together these more specific criteria that would help answer that in the future. And that's the purpose of having that city-initiated annexation policy, as well as what we've heard tonight, that maybe we should also include triggers that would identify when annexation is never going to be appropriate or should not be appropriate. So we want that to continue as part of this process. Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're all here about, is
Yep.
we want to know that we got a bullseye on our head or not. I mean, 'cause that's, it affects our housing sales,
Yep.
it affects everybody.
But the thing that we found in life is that you can never say never,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? So, but
And it
we're
wouldn't
trying
be- and it
to
would not
clarify
be-
it as much as possible.
Yep.
Yes.
And it would not be fair for us to say that as well, just like it wouldn't be fair for us not to at least address the ADA situation there too. I think you need to go into it with your eyes wide open. But just to clarify again, the criteria we're not applying that to the large subdivisions because as Mr. Cooper just stated again, there's not an interest at this point in time. So, I mean, technically, you're at, Jeff, where I think you want to be at right now.
You're saying this criteria is not for us? That's what you just said?
Well, they don't have an interest in applying it to you.
Right.
So
Is that safe to say at this point in time?
For now.
You want to take this seat?
Okay. The annexation criteria would simply leave the door open that under compelling reasons,
Right.
which we have to determine what those compelling reasons are, that a city-initiated annexation process could potentially start. That's all that we're trying to put out here with this discussion, to leave the door open.
Councilor Knight.
I guess for my part, I just have to interject that you can't tie the hands of a future administration or a future legislative body. You never know what could happen in the future, but all we can say today is this is what they're bringing forward. If they or we said never, we would know we were deceiving you. I mean, I can't guarantee you in the next 100 years that a certain property is not, I can't say this property will never be rezoned. I mean, people ask that all the time. We can't make that promise, but this is as firm as I think they can be to try to lay some ground rules, and I think that's the best we can do.
I have a question.
Honestly.
Any other questions, Jeff?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oops. Other Jeff.
I don't think we've answered his question. His question was, does it apply to Split Rock Heights or not? That's his question is, you don't have the, and I'm on your side on that. You're saying you don't have any interest at this point in entering into a city-initiated annexation with Split Rock Heights.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, that's the answer that I wanted to hear for them.
Okay.
Ryan Bauer, any other neighborhoods, because I am from Split Rock Heights, so I'm sorry we're past the minutes. But real quick,
that's fine.
Even for all the people, just not Split Rock Heights, Mr. Cooper, you're not off the hot seat, please. Come back up. Question really is to the criteria number one. My question is ag land considered developed? Yes or no? Okay. No. Very good.
Gal, no, I could have answered that one.
Okay. You're educated. Very good. Question number two on criteria number two is Split Rock Heights next to us, our 26th Street that runs east and west. Does that meet criteria number two? A yes or no?
Yes. 26th Street is not currently approved east of Veterans Parkway.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Number three, Greg and Jeff, your point on making a recommendation to criteria number 5 about a cost-benefit analysis. I appreciate that comment greatly. Hammer on the nail there. Number 6 criteria I'd like to add to it is meet the people from the other gentleman that spoke earlier. I think you all have to meet the people when you go through an annexation process. So with that, I appreciate the movement of the city as well as your efforts tonight and the information shared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's nice to hear that applause at the end of the evening here. Everybody clear on the September 13th open house, public library. And if I could just mention one more thing, because our staff has been here all day since 8 o'clock, if we could clear the building as quickly as we can, as is reasonable. Take conversations outside maybe. I would even be willing to stick around outside if you can. That frees up our staff to go home for the evening. But thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.